The congressional campaign began at 8 a.m. the Tuesday after Labor Day, with Walter Winchell up on a soapbox at Broadway and 42nd Street, the celebrated crossroads where he'd announced his presidential candidacy from atop the very same genuine wooden soapbox, and looking in broad daylight exactly as press photos pictured him broadcasting from the NBC studios Sunday nights at 9. Jacketless in his shirt sleeves, with the cuffs rolled up and his tie yanked down and pushed back from his forehead, the hard-boiled newsman's fedora. Within only minutes, some half-dozen mounted New York City policemen were already needed to divert traffic away from the eager stream of working people charging into the street to hear and see him in the flesh. And once word spread that the orator with the bullhorn wasn't just another Bible bore prophesizing doom for sinful America, but the Stork Club Habitue, only recently the country's most influential radio broadcaster and the city's most nefarious tabloid journalist, the number of onlookers grew from the hundreds to the thousands. Nearly 10,000 people, all told, said the papers, up from the subways and emptying out of the buses, down by the Maverick and his immoderation. The broadcasting cowards, he told them, and the billionaire publishing hooligans controlled from the White House by the Lindbergh gang say Winchell was canned for crying fire in a crowded theater. Mr. and Mrs. New York City, the word wasn't fire, it was fascism, Winchell cried. It was fascism, Winchell cried, and it still is. Fascism, fascism, and I will continue crying fascism to every crowd of Americans I can find until Herr Lindbergh's pro-Hitler party of treason is driven from the Congress on Election Day. The Hitlerites can take away my radio microphone, and they've done just that, as you know. They can take away my newspaper column, and they have done just that, as you know. And when, God forbid, America goes fascist, Lindbergh stormtroopers can lock me away in a concentration camp to shut me up. And they will do that, too, as you know. They can even lock you away in a concentration camp to shut you up. And I hope by now that you damn well know that. But what our homegrown Hitlerites cannot take away is my love for America and yours. My love for democracy and yours. My love for freedom and yours. What they cannot take away, unless the gullible and the sheepish and the terrified are patsies enough to return them to Washington one more time, is the power of the ballot box. The Hitlerite plot against America must be stopped, and stopped by you, Mr. and Mrs. New York, by the voting power of the freedom-loving people of this great city, on Tuesday, November 3rd, 1942. All that day, September 8th, 1942, and into the evening, Winchell climbed atop his soapbox in every neighborhood in Manhattan, from Wall Street, where he was largely ignored, to Little Italy, where he was shouted down, to Greenwich Village, where he was ridiculed, to the Garment District, where he was intermittently cheered, to the Upper West Side, where he was welcomed as their savior by the Roosevelt Jews, and eventually north to Harlem, where in the crowd of several hundred Negroes who gathered at dusk to hear him speak at the corner of Lenox Avenue and 15th Street, a few laughed and a handful applauded, but most remained respectfully dissatisfied, as though to work his way into their antipathies would require his delivering a very different spiel. It was difficult to ascertain the impact Winchell made on the voting public that day. To Winchell's former paper, Hearst's Daily Mirror, the ostensible effort to gather grassroots support for routing the Republican Party from Congress nationwide looked more like a publicity stunt than anything else, a predictably egomaniacal publicity stunt by an unemployed gossip columnist who could not bear being out of the spotlight, and especially so since not a single Democratic congressional candidate running for election in Manhattan chose to appear anywhere within hearing distance of the Winchell bullhorn. If any candidates were out campaigning, they stayed far away wherever Winchell repeatedly committed the political blunder of associating the name Adolf Hitler with that of an American president whose heroics the world still idolized, whose achievements even the Fuhrer respected, and whom an overwhelming majority of his countrymen continue to adore as their nation's godlike catalyst of peace and prosperity. In a brief sardonic editorial, added again, the New York Times was able to reach but one conclusion, about the latest of Winchell's self-serving shenanigans. There is nothing Walter Winchell has more talent for, wrote the Times, than himself. Winchell spent a full day in each of the other 4 boroughs of the city, and the following week headed north to Connecticut. Though still in want of a Democratic candidate willing to wed a fledgling congressional campaign to his inflammatory rhetoric, Winchell went ahead to set up his soapbox outside the gates of the factories of Bridgeport and at the entrance of the shipyards in New London, where he pushed back his fedora, pulled down his tie, and cried, "Fascism! Fascism!" into the face of the crowds. From Connecticut's industrial coast, he traveled north, again to the working-class enclaves of Providence, and then crossed from Rhode Island into the factory towns of southeastern Massachusetts, addressing tiny street corner gatherings in Fall River, Brockton, and Quincy with no less fervor than he'd expended in his maiden speech in Times Square. From Quincy, he went to Boston, where he planned to spend 3 days moving through Irish Dorchester and South Boston into the Italian North End. However, his first afternoon at South Boston's busy Perkins Square, the few jeering hecklers who'd been baiting him as a Jew ever since his departing his native New York, and his leaving behind there the police protection guaranteed him by Fiorello LaGuardia, the city's anti-Lindbergh Republican mayor, burgeoned into a mob waving handmade placards reminiscent of the banners and signs beautifying the Bund rallies in Madison Square Garden. And the moment Winchell opened his mouth to speak, somebody brandishing a burning cross rushed toward the soapbox and set him aflame, and a gun was fired twice into the air as a signal from the organizers to the rioters, or as a warning to the marked man from Jew York, or as both. There, in the old brick cityscape of little family-run shops, streetcars, and shade trees and small houses, each topped back then, before TV, by only one appendage, a towering chimney, in the Boston where the Depression had never ended, amid storefronts sacred to the American Main Street, the ice cream parlor, the barber shop, the pharmacy, and just up the way from the dark, spiky outline of St. Augustine's Church, thugs with clubs surged forward, screaming, "Kill him!" And 2 weeks from its inception, in New York's 5 boroughs, the Winchell campaign, as Winchell had imagined it, was underway. He had at last brought the Lindbergh grotesquerie to the surface, the underside of Lindbergh's affable blandness raw and undisguised. Though the Boston police did nothing to restrain the rioters, the gunshots had sounded a full hour before a squad car drove up to survey the scene. The plainclothes team of armed professional bodyguards who'd been stationed at Winchell's side throughout the trip managed to douse the flames, consuming one of his trouser legs, and having freed him from the first wave of the crowd after only a few blows had fallen, to lift him into a car parked just yards from the soapbox and drive him to Kearny Hospital on Telegraph Hill, where he was treated for facial wounds and minor burns. His first visitor at the hospital wasn't the mayor, Maurice Tobin, or Tobin's defeated mayoral rival, ex-governor James M. Curley, another FDR Democrat who, like Democrat Tobin, wanted no part of Walter Winchell. Nor was it the local congressman, John W. McCormick, whose roughneck brother, a bartender known as Naco, presided over the neighborhood with as much authority as the popular Democratic representative. To everyone's surprise, beginning with Walter Winchell himself, the first visitor was a patrician Republican of distinguished New England lineage, the 2-term Massachusetts governor, Leverett Saltonstall. On hearing of Winchell's hospitalization, Governor Saltonstall had left his State House office to communicate his concern directly to Winchell, whom, privately, he could only have despised, and to promise a thorough investigation into the well-plotted, obviously premeditated pandemonium that, by a mere fluke, had produced no fatalities. He also assured Winchell of protection by the state police, and, if need be, by National Guard, for as long as Winchell campaigned in Massachusetts. And before the governor left the hospital, he saw to it that two armed troopers were stationed at the door, only feet from Winchell's bed. The Boston Herald interpreted Saltonstall's intervention as a political maneuver to gain him recognition as a courteous, honorable, fair-minded conservative who could serve his party as a dignified replacement in 1944 for the Democratic Vice President Burton K. Wheeler, who'd done the job required in the 1940 campaign, but whose imprudence as an orator many Republicans now believed might compromise their president the second time around. In a hospital press conference, where Winchell appeared before the photographers in his robe, with surgical dressings half covering his face and a heavily bandaged left foot, he welcomed Governor Saltonstall's offer, but declined assistance in a message cast now that he was under assault in language more statesmanlike than his standard feverish patter, that was distributed to the 24 reporters from the radio and the press who had converged on his room. The statement began, "On the day when a candidate for the presidency of the United States requires a phalanx of armed police officers and National Guardsmen to protect his right to free speech, this great country will have passed over into fascist barbarism. I cannot accept that the religious intolerance emanating from the White House has already so corrupted the ordinary citizen that he has lost all respect for fellow Americans of a creed or faith different from his own. I cannot accept that the abhorrence of my religion shared by Adolf Hitler and Charles A. Lindbergh can already have corroded." From then on, anti-Semitic agitators hunted Winchell down at every crossing, though without success in Boston, where Saltonstall had ignored Winchell's grandstanding and directed his troops to impose order, employing force if need be to carry the violent off to jail, a command that they undertook to execute, however reluctantly. Meanwhile, using a cane to support himself because of his burned foot and with his jaw and forehead still bandaged, Winchell proceeded to draw an angry mob chanting, "Kike, go home!" in every single parish where he displayed his stigmata to the faithful, from the Gate of Heaven Church in South Boston to St. Gabriel's Monastery in Brighton, beyond Massachusetts and communities in upper New York State, in Pennsylvania and throughout the Midwest that were already notorious for their bigotry, and to which Winchell's explosive strategy inevitably pointed him. Most of the local authorities did not share Saltonstall's unwillingness to tolerate civil unrest, and so, despite the doubling of his entourage of plainclothes bodyguards, the candidate came close to getting himself mauled each time he stepped onto the soapbox to denounce the fascist in the White House and to assign responsibility directly to the president's religious hatred and fostering unheard-of Nazi barbarism in the American streets. The worst and most widespread violence occurred in Detroit, the Midwestern headquarters of the radio priest, Father Coughlin, and his Jew-hating Christian Front, and of the crowd-pleasing minister known as the Dean of Anti-Semites, Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, who preached that Christian character is the true basis of real Americanism. Detroit, of course, was also home to the American automobile industry, and to Lindbergh's elderly Secretary of the Interior, Henry Ford, whose avowedly anti-Semitic newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published in the 1920s, addressed itself as an investigation of the Jewish question that Ford ultimately reprinted in 4 volumes, totaling nearly 1,000 pages, entitled The International Jew, in which he directed that in the cleansing of America, the international Jew and his satellites, as the conscious enemies of all Anglo-Saxons mean by civilization, are not spared. It was to be expected that organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and eminent liberal journalists like John Gunther and Dorothy Thompson would be outraged by the Detroit riots and immediately make public their disgust. But so too were many conventional middle-class Americans who even if they found Walter Winchell and his rhetoric repugnant and understood him to be asking for trouble, were also appalled by the eyewitness reports of how the rioting had begun at Winchell's first stop in Hamtramck, the residential section inhabited chiefly by auto workers and their families, and said to contain the world's largest Polish population outside Warsaw, had suspiciously spread within minutes to 12th Street, to Linwood, and then to Dexter Boulevard. There, in the city's biggest Jewish neighborhood, shops were looted and windows broken, Jews trapped outdoors were set upon and beaten, and kerosene-soaked crosses were ignited on lawns of the fancy houses along Chicago Boulevard, and out front of the modest 2-family dwellings of the house painters, plumbers, butchers, bakers, junk dealers, and grocers who lived on Webb and Tuxedo, and in their little dirt yards of the poorest Jews in Pingree and Euclid. In mid-afternoon, only moments before the school day ended, a firebomb was thrown into the front foyer of Winterhalter Elementary School, where half the students were Jewish, another into the foyer of Central High, whose student body was 95% Jewish, and another through a window at the Sholem Aleichem Institute, a cultural organization Coughlin had ridiculously identified as communist. A fourth outside another of Coughlin's communist targets, the Jewish Workers' Alliance, and we will pause there.